In the spring of 1867, a wandering cattle buyer named Jeremiah Thornton arrived at the isolated Estrella Ranch in the desolate plains of West Texas seeking prime livestock. What he stumbled upon beneath the windswept soil of the Rodriguez family's vast estate would become one of the darkest secrets in Texas history. 78 cowboys had vanished without a trace over the course of 2 years, all last seen entering the employment of Ernesto Rodriguez and his 3 sons. The official stories told of men moving on to other ranches or returning east, but no neighboring ranch ever reported their arrival. When Jeremiah finally uncovered the truth about the Rodriguez family's cattle branding pit, he found evidence of systematic torture, ritualistic branding of human flesh, and calculated murder that would shake even the most hardened frontier lawman to his core. The Texas Rangers buried the full investigation report for nearly a century, but recently discovered documents reveal the horrifying details of what really happened on that isolated stretch of grazing land, including Ernesto Rodriguez's own leather-bound journal describing his family's mission to mark the unworthy as their exclusive property. Before we continue with the story of the Rodriguez family and the disappearance of those 78 souls, if you're someone who seeks the truth behind America's forgotten frontier atrocities, then this channel is for you. Subscribe now and let me know in the comments what state you're listening from. I read every single comment and love connecting with fellow history seekers who aren't afraid to confront the shadows of our past. The events that unfolded at Estrella Ranch would challenge everything we thought we knew about cattle barons' frontier justice and the men who built their empires on the blood and bones of those who crossed them. To understand the full horror of what the Rodriguez family had created, we must first understand the harsh landscape and desperate times that allowed them to operate with impunity for nearly 2 years. Diablo County, Texas was a place that civilization had barely touched, even as the rest of the country began rebuilding after the Civil War. Nestled in the unforgiving plains of West Texas, approximately 90 miles northwest of San Antonio, it had emerged during the chaos of Reconstruction as a lawless territory where former Confederate soldiers, desperate immigrants, and men running from their past could disappear into the vast emptiness. The county never boasted more than a few hundred souls scattered across thousands of acres of drought-prone rangeland, but its isolation made it perfect for those seeking to escape their histories or, as the Rodriguez family demonstrated, for predators seeking absolute control over their domain. The region had been claimed in 1863 by Ernesto Rodriguez, a former Mexican military officer who had acquired significant wealth through mysterious means during the turbulent border conflicts of the previous decade. The rumors whispered around campfires but never spoken in the presence of the Rodriguez men suggested that Ernesto had massacred a unit of Confederate soldiers transporting gold intended for weapons purchases in Mexico. But in the chaotic atmosphere of wartime Texas, where loyalties shifted like the desert sands, such questions about a man's fortune were considered foolish at best and suicidal at worst. Estrella Ranch sprawled across nearly 20,000 acres of prime grazing land centered around a natural spring that provided the only reliable water source for miles. The ranch house itself stood like a fortress on a low rise overlooking the property, a massive 2-story adobe structure built in the Spanish colonial style, with thick walls that kept out both the scorching heat and potential enemies. Watchtowers, disguised as decorative features, graced each corner, allowing constant surveillance of the approaches to the main compound. The Rodriguez operation consisted of the main house, bunkhouses for the regular ranch hands, a blacksmith's forge larger than most small-town operations, extensive corrals and cattle pens, and the all-important branding pit, a sunken stone chamber where the family's distinctive star and crescent brand was seared into the hides of their extensive herds. The branding pit was unusually elaborate for a cattle operation, with stone steps leading down to a circular chamber large enough to hold dozens of men. Rodriguez claimed the unusual design was based on the branding facilities of elite Spanish ranches, but those who saw it often remarked on its resemblance to ancient sacrificial pits they'd seen in illustrations of pre-Columbian Mexico. The most remote section of the ranch, hidden behind a ridge nearly 5 miles from the main house, contained what Rodriguez called his special breeding program, a separate operation that few of the regular hands ever visited. This isolated area, surrounded by its own fence line and guarded by the eldest Rodriguez son at all times, was where Ernesto claimed to be developing a superior strain of longhorn cattle through selective breeding. The few outsiders who caught glimpses of this restricted area noted the unusual stone buildings and deep pit-like structures that seemed excessive for livestock management. Ernesto Rodriguez himself was a figure who commanded fear as much as respect. Standing barely 5'7" but powerfully built, with the compact strength of a lifelong horseman, he moved through his domain with the calculating precision of a predator. His salt and pepper hair was always neatly trimmed beneath his wide-brimmed black hat, and his waxed mustache gave him the appearance of a gentleman rancher despite the calluses on his hands and the weathered creases around his eyes that spoke of a life spent in the harsh Texas sun. When he spoke, his voice carried the cultured tones of a man educated in Mexico City's finest schools, occasionally slipping into Spanish when emotion overtook him. His immaculate appearance, even in the dusty conditions of frontier ranching, created an aura of authority that few dared to challenge. The elaborate silver spurs he wore, even when not riding, and the custom-made silver-handled whip he carried at all times, became symbols of his absolute control over everyone and everything within his reach. Rodriguez had arrived in Texas with impressive credentials, carrying documents that detailed his education at prestigious schools in Mexico City and letters of introduction from prominent landowners in Coahuila. His knowledge of cattle breeding and ranch management was undeniable. He could calculate grazing capacity, market fluctuations, and breeding outcomes with remarkable accuracy, and his innovations in water management had allowed him to run larger herds than neighboring ranches thought possible on the drought-prone land. The local cattlemen considered themselves fortunate to have such an accomplished rancher in their midst, especially given the challenges of rebuilding the Texas cattle industry after the war had disrupted traditional markets and drive routes. Ernesto's 3 sons each embodied different aspects of their father's personality, amplified to disturbing degrees. Alejandro, the eldest at 32, was the tactical mind of the operation, cold, calculating, and utterly without mercy. His lean, almost skeletal frame and perpetually narrowed eyes gave him the appearance of a circling vulture waiting for weakness. He managed the ranch's business affairs and the special breeding program with the same methodical precision, keeping immaculate records in leather-bound ledgers that never left his possession. Raymond, the middle son at 28, was the enforcer, a hulking figure with hands like sledgehammers, who had been rumored to kill a man with a single punch during a dispute in San Antonio. He supervised the regular ranch hands with brutal efficiency, meting out punishment for even minor infractions. The Cowboys called him El Toro behind his back, both for his bull-like physique and his tendency to charge at the slightest provocation. Felipe, the youngest at 24, was perhaps the most disturbing of the 3. Handsome and charming when the situation required, he was responsible for recruiting new hands from distant towns and settlements. His refined manners and generous signing bonuses lured many cowboys to Estrella Ranch, particularly those without family connections or established reputations in the cattle industry. But behind his engaging smile lurked a sadistic creativity that would become legendary among those unfortunate enough to witness it firsthand. The Rodriguez family kept no domestic servants despite their obvious wealth, managing the main house themselves and keeping outsiders away from their private quarters. Ernesto explained this unusual arrangement as a family tradition dating back to their Spanish ancestors, who believed that true nobility meant self-sufficiency rather than reliance on servants. A Rodriguez man makes his own bed and cooks his own meals, he would tell visitors with obvious pride. We don't need women fussing around our personal space. The main house itself reflected this philosophy of controlled access. While impressive in size and construction, it remained largely off-limits to anyone outside the immediate family. The first floor contained a grand entrance hall, a formal dining room used for business meetings, and Ernesto's office, the only spaces that visitors were ever permitted to enter. The second floor, accessible only by a single staircase that could be seen from Ernesto's office, remained a mystery to outsiders, with heavy wooden doors that were always kept locked. Most peculiar of all was the family's handling of their cattle sales and worker payments. Unlike other ranchers who conducted business through banks and contracts, Ernesto insisted on managing all financial transactions personally, meeting buyers at predetermined locations away from the main ranch, and paying his workers in cash drawn from his seemingly bottomless private reserves. This practice, while unusual, was explained as a distrust of Eastern banking institutions that had frozen Mexican assets during previous border conflicts. The distinctive Rodriguez brand, a 5-pointed star enclosed within a crescent moon, became well known throughout Texas cattle markets. Buyers remarked on the unusual clarity and consistency of the brand, which was always perfectly placed and remarkably deep. Rodriguez cattle are marked for life, cattle buyers would comment, noting that even years later, the brand remained clearly visible on animals sold to other ranches. What none of them realized was the ritual significance the family attached to their branding process, a significance that went far beyond simple livestock identification. The pattern of disappearances that would eventually claim 78 lives began in the bitter winter of 1865, though nobody connected the scattered incidents at first. The transition was so gradual, so carefully managed, that it seemed like nothing more than the natural drift of restless cowboys moving between jobs as they had always done on the frontier. Men would be hired at Estrella Ranch, work for a few months, and then supposedly move on to other opportunities. Ernesto or one of his sons would casually mention to neighboring ranchers that such and such cowboy had decided to try his luck further north, or had received a letter calling him back east to his family. The winter of 1865 to 66 was particularly harsh, with blue northers sweeping down from the plains, bringing freezing temperatures that killed livestock and isolated ranches for weeks at a time. This natural isolation created perfect conditions for the Rodriguez operation to establish its patterns without outside scrutiny. The few law enforcement officials in the region, primarily focused on Indian raids and Mexican border incursions, had neither the time nor the resources to investigate the movements of transient cowboys. The first documented victim was Patrick Flynn, an Irish immigrant who had arrived in Texas just months after the end of the Civil War. Flynn had worked on several ranches in the San Antonio area before hearing about the high wages offered at Estrella Ranch. With no family in America and only casual acquaintances among the local cowboys, Flynn was the perfect initial target, a man whose disappearance would raise few immediate questions. Flynn was hired during a cattle auction in San Antonio, where Felipe Rodriguez had gone to recruit new hands for the spring roundup. Witnesses later recalled that Felipe had been particularly attentive to Flynn's situation, asking detailed questions about his background and family connections while buying rounds of whiskey for the entire gathering. By the end of the evening, Flynn had signed on with Estrella Ranch for twice the going rate of local cowboys, seemingly the beneficiary of extraordinary good fortune. Flynn's first weeks at Estrella Ranch followed the normal pattern of a new hire. He was assigned basic tasks, evaluated for his skills, and gradually integrated into the ranch operation. Other hands noted that he was a capable horseman with a particular talent for calming nervous cattle during branding, a skill that unfortunately brought him to Ernesto's personal attention. 3 weeks after his arrival, Flynn was selected for what Ernesto called special duties at the remote section of the ranch. He rode out with Alejandro one morning and never returned to the bunkhouse. When one of the other hands inquired about Flynn's whereabouts, Raymond explained that the Irishman had been sent to accompany a cattle shipment to Kansas and would likely be gone for several weeks. This explanation seemed reasonable enough at the time, as such assignments were common in cattle country. But when months passed without Flynn's return, his former bunkmates began to wonder about his fate. The second disappearance followed a similar pattern, but introduced a new element that would become central to the Rodriguez operation. Thomas Weber, a German immigrant with experience on cattle drives, was hired at a livestock show in Austin, where Philippe had again served as recruiter. Weber lasted nearly 2 months at Estrella Ranch before being selected for special duties. But during his final week, other hands noticed unusual burns on his forearm that he refused to discuss. "It's nothing," Weber told his concerned bunkmates, keeping his arm wrapped in a filthy bandage. "Just got careless around the branding irons." But one cowboy who caught a glimpse of the wound during a washing session reported that it looked nothing like the accidental burns common among ranch hands. Instead of the irregular scar of a momentary contact with a hot iron, Weber's arm bore what appeared to be a deliberate mark, small but unmistakably similar to the Rodriguez brand. Weber disappeared 3 days later, with Raymond explaining that he had received an urgent message about family troubles in New Braunfels and had departed immediately, leaving behind his few possessions with instructions to donate them to the other hands. This hasty departure struck the remaining cowboys as odd, but frontier life was full of sudden changes and unexpected emergencies, and questions about another man's business were generally discouraged. As winter gave way to spring and the pace of ranch operations increased, the pattern of disappearances accelerated. Men would be hired, work for varying periods ranging from weeks to months, and then vanish without warning. Each disappearance was explained with plausible stories: family emergencies, better opportunities elsewhere, disagreements with management that led to resignation, or occasional claims that troublesome employees had been dismissed and escorted off the property. Vera Hutchins, who ran the general store in the tiny settlement of Diablo Springs 15 miles from the ranch, was the first person to notice something strange about the pattern. As the only commercial establishment within a day's ride of several ranches, Hutchins' store served as both supply depot and informal message center for the region. Cowboys from surrounding ranches would leave mail and messages there for collection, purchase supplies on credit against their wages, and occasionally leave personal items in Vera's safekeeping if they planned to travel. Vera was a widow in her 50s who had taken over the store after her husband's death during the war. Her sharp mind and excellent memory for details made her an important hub of information in the sparsely populated county. She knew the comings and goings of nearly everyone in the region and maintained a meticulous credit ledger that tracked the financial situations of most local cowboys. "Something ain't right about those Rodriguez men," Vera confided to Sheriff Thaddeus Jenkins during one of his infrequent visits to the settlement. "I've been keeping track of their hiring patterns, and not a single man they've brought on in the past 8 months has ever come back through my store. Other ranches, their boys come and go regular, picking up mail, buying supplies, settling debts when they get paid. But Estrella hands, they vanish like morning mist." Jenkins, an aging lawman more concerned with keeping peace than investigating mysteries, initially dismissed Vera's concerns as the overactive imagination of a lonely widow. "Ranch work is transient by nature, Ms. Hutchins," he explained with the patient tone of a man who believed women had no head for business matters. "Those Rodriguez boys pay top dollar, and likely their hands are just moving on to other opportunities with their pockets full." But Vera was not easily dissuaded once her suspicions were aroused. She began keeping a dedicated notebook recording the names of men known to have taken employment at Estrella Ranch, the dates they were last seen, and any unusual circumstances. surrounding their disappearances. She also noted the increasing reluctance of experienced local cowboys to accept work at the ranch despite the premium wages offered. "Local men won't ride for Rodriguez anymore," she observed in her journal. "Only strangers and desperados take his silver now. Something has spooked the men who know the territory, something they won't speak of directly but warn each other about in whispers." The most disturbing entry in Vera's journal concerned a young cowboy named Daniel Abernathy, who had worked at Estrella Ranch for nearly 3 months before appearing at her store in a state of obvious terror. Abernathy, a normally cheerful young man from Tennessee, arrived shortly before closing time on a stormy evening in April 1866, his horse nearly ridden to collapse and his clothes soaked with rain and sweat. "Ms. Hutchins," he gasped, his eyes constantly darting to the windows and door. "I need supplies for a long journey, and I need them now. I'm leaving the territory tonight, no matter the weather." When Vera asked what had happened to frighten him so badly, Abernathy at first refused to elaborate, insisting that ignorance would be safer for her. But as she helped him gather provisions, his resolve weakened, and he began to share fragmented details of what he had witnessed at the ranch. "The branding pit isn't just for cattle," he whispered, his hands shaking so badly he could barely count out coins for his purchases. "I saw them take Fletcher down there yesterday, not to work, but tied up like a calf for marking. The screams." He paused, swallowing hard. "No man should make sounds like that, Ms. Hutchins." And they were all watching, the whole Rodriguez family, like it was some kind of ceremony. Before Abernathy could provide more details, the store door burst open, admitting Raymond Rodriguez and 2 ranch hands. The young cowboy's face went ashen, and he backed away toward the storeroom. "Abernathy," Raymond called, his voice deceptively casual. "You left without collecting your wages, boy. Father was concerned about you riding out in this weather without your due payment. What happened next would haunt Vera's nightmares for years to come." Abernathy, seeing no escape route, suddenly drew a small Derringer pistol from his boot, a defensive weapon carried by many travelers, but rarely used in confrontations. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice breaking with terror. "I'm leaving the territory, and none of you are going to stop me." Raymond's response was a chilling display of the family's true nature. Instead of showing concern or surprise at having a gun pointed at him, he smiled, a cold, anticipatory expression that contained no humor or humanity. "You misunderstand your situation, Daniel," he said softly, taking a step forward despite the trembling pistol. "Nobody leaves Estrella Ranch without Father's permission. Certainly not after what you've seen." The confrontation ended with shocking swiftness. As Abernathy's nerve failed and he glanced toward Vera as if seeking help, Raymond covered the distance between them in 2 rapid strides. A single massive blow knocked the pistol away, followed by a second strike that left the young cowboy unconscious on the plank floor. "He's been unstable for weeks," Raymond explained to Vera as his men bound Abernathy's hands and feet with practiced efficiency. "Father kept him on out of charity, but it seems his mind has finally broken completely. We'll take him back to the ranch and send for the doctor from San Antonio." The look that passed between Raymond and Vera made it clear that he knew she didn't believe a word of his explanation, just as he knew there was nothing she could do about it. "I trust you'll keep this unfortunate incident to yourself, Ms. Hutchins," he said as his men carried Abernathy's limp form to their waiting horses. Gossip about mental instability could ruin a young man's prospects in the territory. As they departed into the stormy night, Raymond paused in the doorway. "One more thing, Ms. Hutchins. I noticed you keep a journal behind your counter. A sensible practice for a business owner. I do hope you're being careful about the entries you make regarding your neighbors. False information, even recorded privately, can sometimes lead to unfortunate misunderstandings." The threat was unmistakable, and Vera understood that her observations had not gone unnoticed by the Rodriguez family. After that night, she became more circumspect in her record-keeping, hiding her journal in a false bottom of a flour barrel and coding her entries to disguise their true meaning. But she continued to document the pattern of disappearances, driven by the haunting memory of Daniel Abernathy's terror and the certainty that something monstrous was occurring at Estrella Ranch. By the fall of 1866, Vera's coded journal contained the names of 37 men who had disappeared after taking employment with the Rodriguez family. None had ever returned to collect mail, settle debts, or retrieve possessions left in her safekeeping, a pattern so consistent that it defied innocent explanation. More disturbing were the rumors that began to circulate among the Mexican vaqueros, who occasionally passed through the region. Whispered stories about El Rancho de los Marcados, the ranch of the marked ones, and crosses secretly placed on the trail near Estrella's boundaries. As the long winter of 1866 to 67 settled over Diablo County, the mysteries surrounding Estrella Ranch deepened. Travelers reported seeing fires burning through the night at the remote section of the property, accompanied by sounds that some described as ritualistic chanting and others more bluntly called screams. Local wildlife seemed to avoid the entire eastern boundary of the ranch, with hunters noting the strange absence of deer, coyotes, and even birds in areas adjacent to Rodriguez land. Most telling of all was the growing collection of distinctive spurs, pocket watches, and personal effects that began to appear among the Rodriguez ranch hands and family members. Alejandro rode into Diablo Springs wearing boots that Vera Hutchins immediately recognized as having belonged to Thomas Weber, their German craftsmanship unmistakable in the frontier settlement. Philippe appeared at a cattle auction sporting a gold watch chain that had certainly been the prized possession of Patrick Flynn, who had proudly shown it to Vera just days before taking employment at the ranch. These small details, seemingly insignificant in isolation, formed a damning pattern when viewed collectively. But in a territory where law enforcement was sparse and family loyalty was absolute, there seemed to be little chance of official intervention. Sheriff Jenkins, when presented with Vera's carefully documented concerns, merely shrugged and pointed out that owning similar items proved nothing, and men had always disappeared on the frontier without explanation. "Unless you have a body, Ms. Hutchins," he told her with the weary patience of a man who preferred comfortable ignorance to disturbing truth, "there's nothing I can do about cowboys who choose to move on without saying goodbye. The Rodriguez family brings substantial business to this county, and I won't harass them based on store gossip and women's intuition." What Jenkins and others failed to appreciate was that Vera Hutchins was not just a concerned storekeeper, but a woman with connections throughout Texas. Her late husband had been a Mason with brothers in every significant settlement from San Antonio to El Paso, and her own family included a cousin who had recently joined the newly reorganized Texas Rangers. As the disappearances continued and local authorities remained indifferent, Vera began a careful campaign of letter writing that would eventually bring Jeremiah Thornton to Estrella Ranch. Thornton's arrival in the spring of 1867 appeared to be nothing more extraordinary than a cattle buyer looking for stock to drive north to the railheads. His weathered appearance and practical knowledge of the cattle business raised no immediate suspicions, and his letters of introduction from prominent buyers in San Antonio established his credentials convincingly enough that even the cautious Rodriguez family welcomed his interest in their herds. What the Rodriguez men didn't know was that Jeremiah Thornton was not merely a cattle buyer, but a former Texas Ranger who had left the service after being wounded during a border skirmish. His cousin's letters about the suspicious activities at Estrella Ranch had drawn him out of semi-retirement and into an unofficial investigation that would expose one of the most disturbing criminal enterprises in Texas history. Thornton's initial visit to Estrella Ranch revealed an operation that, on its surface, appeared to be an exceptionally well-managed cattle business. The visible herds were healthy, the regular hands were competent, if unusually close-mouthed, and the Rodriguez family presented themselves as ambitious, but otherwise ordinary ranchers. But Thornton's experienced eye noticed details that others might have missed: the unusually stringent security measures around certain areas of the property, the careful management of which hands were allowed to interact with visitors, and the subtle tension that seemed to affect everyone when Ernesto Rodriguez entered a room. Most significant was Thornton's observation of the branding pit during a demonstration arranged to show off the quality of the Rodriguez stock. While the process appeared normal to casual observation, Thornton noted the unusual depth of the branding marks and the ritualistic elements that accompanied what should have been a purely practical procedure. Each animal was positioned precisely. The brand was applied for exactly the same duration, regardless of the animal's size. And Ernesto Rodriguez spoke what sounded like a memorized phrase in Spanish before each application of the hot iron. When Thornton casually inquired about these unusual elements, Alejandro provided an explanation about family traditions dating back to colonial Spain, where branding had supposedly been elevated to an art form among elite cattle operations. The explanation was delivered smoothly, but Thornton noticed that Reman's hand had moved to rest on his pistol during the questioning, revealing a level of tension disproportionate to such an innocent inquiry. The most disturbing moment of this initial visit came when Thornton, feigning enthusiasm about potentially purchasing a large number of cattle, requested a tour of the entire operation, including the remote special breeding program that Ernesto had mentioned with obvious pride. Earlier in the day, "Our breeding facility is not part of the standard tour, Mr. Thornton," Ernesto replied, his usually fluid manner suddenly stiff and formal. "The specialized techniques we're developing represent a significant investment of family knowledge, and we prefer to maintain our competitive advantage through discretion." When Thornton pressed slightly, suggesting that seeing the superior breeding stock would likely increase his purchase order, the atmosphere in the room changed perceptibly. Felipe's charming smile disappeared, Raymond's hand again moved to his weapon, and Alejandro stepped closer to the visitor in a subtle but unmistakable display of physical intimidation. "Perhaps you misunderstood, Mr. Thornton," Ernesto said, his voice now carrying an edge that hadn't been present before. "Some aspects of our operation remain private, even to valued customers. I'm sure a man of business such as yourself can appreciate the need to protect proprietary methods." The message was clear. The remote section of the ranch was absolutely off-limits, and continued inquiry would not be tolerated. Thornton, recognizing the danger signals, quickly backed down and redirected the conversation to safer topics. But the family's reaction had confirmed his suspicions that something beyond normal ranching operations was occurring at Estrella Ranch, as he departed that evening with promises to return the following week to finalize a purchase agreement. Thornton knew he had touched the edges of something darker than he had initially suspected. The disappearance of transient cowboys was disturbing enough, but the Rodriguez family's behavior suggested an operation of greater complexity and perhaps greater depravity than simple murder for profit or convenience. What Thornton couldn't know as he rode away from Estrella Ranch was that his seemingly innocuous visit had triggered alarm within the Rodriguez family. His questions about the branding process and breeding program, while presented as casual interest, had raised suspicions about his true purpose. Before he had ridden 5 miles toward Diablo Springs, Alejandro was already dispatching men to investigate his background more thoroughly, initiating a deadly race between hunter and hunted that would reach its climax in the bloodiest chapter of Diablo County's history. Jeremiah Thornton knew that his investigation of Estrella Ranch would require a delicate balance of caution and boldness. His years as a Texas Ranger had taught him that frontal assaults against entrenched criminals rarely succeeded, especially when those criminals wielded the kind of local influence the Rodriguez family had accumulated. A more subtle approach would be necessary, one that would allow him to gather evidence without alerting his targets to his true purpose. The cattle buyer persona provided an ideal cover. giving him legitimate reasons to visit the ranch and interact with various workers while observing the operation. But Thornton recognized that the Rodriguez family's suspicion had been aroused by his questions about the remote section of the property. He would need to allay those suspicions before he could dig deeper into their activities. His first step was to establish his credibility as a genuine cattle buyer. Working through contacts in San Antonio, he arranged for the purchase and transfer of a modest herd from Estrella Ranch, 50 head of prime longhorns that were delivered to a legitimate buyer who owed Thornton a favor. The transaction went smoothly, with Thornton paying the premium price that Ernesto Rodriguez demanded without haggling, thereby positioning himself as a valuable customer worth cultivating. This initial purchase opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. When Thornton returned to Estrella Ranch 2 weeks later, his reception was noticeably warmer. Ernesto invited him to dinner in the rarely seen formal dining room of the main house, where the family displayed an elaborate hospitality that seemed designed to impress and distract in equal measure. "Mr. Thornton," Ernesto said as he carved a roast with surgical precision, "your associate in San Antonio speaks highly of the condition of our cattle upon delivery. It seems you have a discerning eye for quality livestock." Thornton accepted the compliment with modest appreciation, using the opening to further cement his cover story. "My clients in Kansas demand the best, don't Ernesto? Their British investors won't accept scrawny, trail-worn beasts. Your stock arrived in prime condition, a testament to your breeding program." The mention of the breeding program caused a momentary stillness around the table, a nearly imperceptible hesitation before Felipe smoothly changed the subject to the spring weather and its impact on grazing conditions. But Thornton had noticed something significant during that pause, a glance between father and eldest son that contained both warning and calculation. Throughout the elaborate meal, Thornton maintained his role as an affable but shrewd businessman, dropping references to other potential purchases and hinting at connections with wealthy Eastern investors looking to expand into Texas cattle. The Rodriguez men responded with appropriate interest, but Thornton noted that at least one family member kept him under observation at all times, even during seemingly casual moments. The dining room itself provided insights into the family's true nature. The walls were adorned with weapons that went beyond the typical frontier display of firearms. Ornate whips, peculiar bladed instruments, and what appeared to be specialized branding irons were mounted in decorative patterns that suggested they were valued as much for their aesthetic qualities as their practical applications. Most telling was a glass-fronted cabinet containing what Thornton first took to be unusually small cattle brands, until closer observation revealed that several were sized for application to human flesh. "You have an interest in branding implements, I see," Thornton remarked casually, nodding toward the cabinet while accepting a glass of surprisingly fine Spanish wine from Ernesto. "A family tradition," Ernesto replied, his eyes calculating as he gauged Thornton's reaction. "My grandfather was renowned in Sonora for his collection. In the old days, branding was considered an art form among the great ranching families. Each mark told a story about the animal's lineage and the land it grazed upon." "And these smaller examples?" Thornton asked, maintaining an expression of merely professional curiosity. Philippe answered before his father could speak. "From the colonial period, when unruly servants and horse thieves were marked as a punishment. Barbaric by today's standards, of course, but historically significant. Father collects them as a reminder of how far civilization has progressed." The explanation was delivered with practiced smoothness, but Thornton noticed that Renan's hand had dropped below the table, likely resting on a concealed weapon. The tension in the room had increased perceptibly, though the Rodriguez men maintained their hospitable facade. Ernesto raised his wineglass in a subtle gesture that seemed to signal his sons. "To progress and civilization," he said with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. and to profitable partnerships, Mr. Thornton." The remainder of the evening proceeded without incident, though Thornton was acutely aware that he was being carefully managed, shown only what the family wanted him to see, and directed away from areas of sensitivity. When he departed with promises to return soon with orders for additional cattle, he knew that his window for investigation was narrowing. The Rodriguez family's suspicions might be temporarily allayed by his business transactions, but they were clearly maintaining careful surveillance of his activities. Thornton's next move was to approach the investigation from a different angle. Rather than focusing on the ranch itself, he turned his attention to the missing cowboys who had disappeared. After taking employment with the Rodriguez family, working through Vera Hutchins at the general store, he began compiling more detailed information about each man, their backgrounds, distinctive characteristics, possessions they might have carried, and any communications they had sent before. Their disappearances. Vera proved to be an invaluable ally in this effort. Her position at the center of local commerce had given her insights that even the most thorough official investigation might have missed. She produced letters that several cowboys had left with her for safekeeping or forwarding, personal items that had been stored in her care, and most importantly, her coded journal documenting the pattern of disappearances over the previous 18 months. 43 men that I know of, Mr. Thornton," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper despite the empty store. "All gone without a trace. Sheriff Jenkins says there's nothing to investigate without bodies, but where do 43 grown men disappear to in a territory this small without leaving some sign?" Thornton studied the journal entries with growing concern. The pattern was even more disturbing than he had initially suspected. The disappearances had started with isolated drifters, men without families or strong connections in the territory. But as those easy targets became scarcer, the Rodriguez operation had begun targeting cowboys with more established backgrounds, creating increasingly elaborate cover stories to explain their absences. Most telling were the possessions that had begun appearing among the Rodriguez men and their trusted hands. Vera had documented specific items: a distinctive silver pocket watch, hand-tooled boots from a German craftsman, a unique belt buckle that had been a family heirloom that had belonged to missing cowboys and were now being openly worn by members of the Rodriguez operation. "They don't even try to hide it," Vera said, her voice tight with anger. "It's like they're flaunting their kills, like mountain lions leaving paw prints around a carcass. And nobody in authority will do a damned thing about it." Armed with this more detailed information, Thornton began his next phase of investigation, locating witnesses who might have observed unusual activities at Estrella Ranch without fully understanding their significance. This search led him to Joaquin Mendoza, a Mexican vaquero who had worked briefly at the ranch during the previous summer before leaving abruptly under circumstances he refused to discuss with anyone. Finding Mendoza proved challenging. The vaquero had left the territory entirely, relocating to a remote ranch near the Rio Grande, where he believed himself beyond the Rodriguez family's reach. When Thornton finally tracked him down, Mendoza initially denied any knowledge of unusual activities at Estrella Ranch, claiming he had left due to a family emergency in Mexico. It took considerable persuasion, including assurances of protection and a substantial payment in gold, before Mendoza would speak openly about his experiences. When he finally began talking, his account exceeded Thornton's worst suspicions about the Rodriguez operation. "I was assigned to the regular ranch work for the first month," Mendoza explained, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings as if expecting Rodriguez men to appear at any moment. Normal cattle work, nothing unusual except the way the hands were watched all the time. No man was ever alone, always at least two working together, always within sight of the main house or one of the Rodriguez sons. After proving himself a capable worker, Mendoza had been selected for what Ernesto called special duties at the remote section of the ranch. He was one of the few workers who had been inside the restricted area and returned to tell about it. What he had witnessed there had sent him fleeing in the night, riding nearly 50 miles without stopping despite the risk of killing his horse. "The breeding program is not for cattle, Senator," Mendoza said, crossing himself before continuing. "The special compound is holding pens for men, not animals. Underground chambers with stone walls and iron rings set into the floors. I was brought there to help with construction of new cells. They were expanding the operation when I was there." According to Mendoza, the remote facility contained both the underground detention cells and a specialized branding chamber similar to the main ranch's cattle branding pit, but designed with features that could only be intended for human subjects. The chamber included restraint systems that could secure struggling men in precise positions, drainage channels in the stone floor, and viewing areas where observers could watch the proceedings from a comfortable distance. "I saw one ceremony," Mendoza whispered, his face pale with the memory. "A cowboy who had tried to leave without permission. They brought him to the pit at midnight. All the Rodriguez men were dressed in black robes with hoods like some kind of unholy church service." Don Ernesto read from a book in Spanish, Old Spanish, like from church books, not modern talking. The ritual that followed was something from a nightmare. The captured cowboy had been stripped to the waist and secured to a stone table in the center of the pit. Ernesto had personally applied a brand to the man's chest, not the standard Rodriguez cattle brand, but a smaller version that Mendoza described as a star inside the horns of the moon, with strange writing around the edges. "They told us it was punishment for breaking contract," Mendoza continued, his voice shaking. "But it wasn't just punishment." Don Ernesto kept talking about marking the worthy and claiming souls for the shadow of the star. It was like he believed he owned the man's soul after putting that mark on him. Most disturbing was what happened after the branding. Rather than releasing the punished cowboy back to work, as would be expected for a disciplinary action, the Rodriguez family had engaged in what Mendoza could only describe as systematic torture. Carefully controlled pain administered with the precision of a medical procedure rather than the chaotic violence of anger or revenge. "They were testing him, Senator," Mendoza explained, struggling to articulate what he had witnessed. "Trying different tools, watching how he responded to each one." Don Ernesto kept notes in a leather book, writing down everything: how the man screamed, how his body moved when he finally passed out, like it was some kind of science experiment. Mendoza had fled that same night, taking advantage of the distraction provided by the ceremony to slip away from the compound. He had ridden south without stopping, abandoning his meager possessions and even the wages he was owed, rather than spend another day at Estrella Ranch. There were others in those underground cells, he concluded, his eyes haunted. Many others. Some had been there a long time, thin like skeletons, covered in burn marks and cuts. "They don't all die quickly, Senator. Some last for months while the Rodriguez men do their tests." Thornton pressed for details about the location of the underground chambers, the number of guards typically present, and any weaknesses in the causae and assaydrusenums security arrangements. Mendoza provided what information he could, though his panic during his escape had left gaps in his observations. But one detail he was absolutely certain about: the current foreman of the remote compound was a man named Victor Sullivan, a former Confederate officer who had a reputation for cruelty even during the war.